You said you needed air. He let the line sit for a second before he answered. I needed 9 days. Somewhere behind her, an airport intercom read out a gate number in a language she didn't know yet. 9 days for what? To leave properly. Asked me how long I was planning it. How long? Guess. Liam, I just flew 11 hours. I don't have the patience for a guessing game. Guess anyway. She was quiet for longer than she meant to be. A week. 9 days. 9 days before what? Before you stood on that stage and called me an early contractor. Her breath caught, thin and static over the line. I need you to understand something, he said. You didn't lose me on that stage. You lost me 9 days later, and the servers noticed before you did. That's not fair. It's accurate. I flew here to talk to you, and you're going to open with a timeline? You asked how long I planned it? I answered. Did you plan it while you were still living with me? While you were making me coffee every morning like nothing was wrong? Yes. How does someone do that? Hand me a mug and already be gone? Practice. I'd been leaving other things quietly for years. You just didn't notice, because I was good at it. She said his name once, quiet, like it still had weight between them. He didn't answer that part. Can I see you? You're seeing me tomorrow, not tonight. Why not tonight? Because tonight I still get to decide. You make it sound like I never let you decide anything. You let me decide everything, right up until the microphone turned on. The line held a silence neither of them filled. I'm not the villain in every version of this, she said. I never said you were the villain. I said you were the founder. Turns out, those weren't the same job. She exhaled, and it came through the phone like static catching on itself. So what happens tomorrow? Tomorrow you get one question answered honestly. That's the whole offer. Just one. It's the only one that matters. You'll know it when you ask it. And tonight I sleep in a city where nobody's ever heard your name attached to mine. The call ended on his side first. He set the phone face down on the railing and looked out at a skyline that owed her nothing. But to understand how a single phone call could carry that much weight, you have to go back further than the stage, further than the 9 days. You have to go back to a spare room, 4 years earlier, and a promise neither of them thought they would ever have to keep. The spare room had one window, a desk built from 2 sawhorses and a door, and a router that overheated every August. That was where the company started, before it had a name that meant anything to strangers. Chloe brought the idea, a wellness platform built around habits instead of willpower. Liam brought 4 years of nights spent making that idea survive contact with real users, real payments, real people who needed the platform to still be there in the morning when they woke up and needed it. The agreement they signed was simple on paper and complicated in every way that mattered. She would be the founder of record, the name on the pitch deck, the face investors would remember after the meeting ended. He would hold equity quietly, structured through paperwork his brother drafted in an afternoon, the kind nobody reads twice before signing. At the time, it felt practical. A story with one founder raced faster. A story with 2 names invited questions about who was really in charge, and neither of them wanted to spend the early years answering that instead of building. It's temporary, she told him, sitting on the floor of the spare room with a laptop balanced on her knees. Once we're stable, I'll say your name in every room that matters. I promise you that. He believed her the way people believe things they've never made anyone say out loud. He didn't ask for a date. He didn't ask for it in writing, because asking would have meant admitting he needed it in writing. And back then, he didn't think he did. He built. He fixed outages at 2 in the morning without waking her. He signed vendor contracts personally because the company had no credit history yet, and his did, quietly becoming the legal backbone of a business that would never once list his name on its own letterhead. The first time he noticed the shape of what was coming, it was small enough to explain away. A dinner with 3 early backers, the kind where relationships got built over shared appetizers and careful stories. Someone asked who he was. This is Liam, Chloe said, already turning toward the next person at the table. He helps out. Nobody at the table clocked it as strange. He didn't correct her. He told himself it didn't mean anything yet, that it was shorthand for a room that didn't need the full arrangement explained, that she'd have said more if the question had come from someone who mattered. He went home that night and pushed a fix to the payment system that had been failing silently for 6 hours, and nobody at that dinner ever knew that either. He told himself the next dinner would be different. Driving home for the first time, he found himself wondering how many more rooms it would take before helps out became the entire story anyone ever heard about him. Victor Calloway joined the board 8 months before the round that was supposed to make everything safe. He arrived with a calm voice and a habit of turning hard questions into opportunities before anyone noticed the question had been dodged entirely. He shook Liam's hand once at the first board dinner and never really addressed him directly again for the rest of that year. A solo founder story raises faster, Victor told Chloe over coffee more than once, in language that never quite said what he meant. Investors like a clean narrative, one name, one vision. It photographs better on a deck, and it photographs better on stage. He didn't say Liam's name should disappear. He didn't have to say it directly for Chloe to hear it anyway. She started making small adjustments, the kind that could each be explained on their own if anyone ever asked. The investor deck went out for a full round of edits, and Liam's name, which had been listed under technical leadership in every version for 2 years, was simply gone from the new one. When he asked about it, she said the deck was getting crowded, that Victor wanted it tighter, that it didn't mean anything about him personally. Then came the press photos for the Series B teaser, 3 of them, shot in the office on a Tuesday afternoon. Liam wasn't told about the shoot until the photographer was already packing up equipment by the elevator. Chloe said scheduling had been a mess, that she'd meant to loop him in, that next time would be different. He believed her, mostly, because believing her had worked for 4 straight years. He asked to see the final images once they were selected for the press kit, out of curiosity more than anything. All 3 showed Chloe alone, at her desk, at the whiteboard, framed against the skyline through the office windows. He was in none of them, not even blurred in a background hallway, and when he mentioned it, she said the photographer had simply gravitated toward her, that these things happened naturally, that it wasn't a decision anyone had made on purpose. He didn't argue. He filed it next to the dinner, another small thing that could be explained away on its own, and told himself the sum of small things wasn't the same as one large one. Then came the stage rehearsal. 2 days before the announcement, in an empty auditorium rented for the night, Chloe ran through her remarks with Victor watching from the second row, arms folded, saying nothing. Liam sat in because he built half the product she was describing on stage and wanted to make sure the technical claims stayed accurate. Watching her rehearse the opening, he noticed something for the first time, plainly, in a way he couldn't unsee afterward. Not once in 11 minutes of prepared remarks did his name appear, not as a founder, not as an engineer, not as a person who existed in the story at all. He didn't say anything that night. He drove home and opened his laptop and did the only thing that made sense to a man who solved problems by fixing them quietly before anyone noticed they'd broken. He started keeping a list, not of complaints, of chances, every place in the last 2 months where she'd had the opportunity to say his name and hadn't taken it. By the time he closed the laptop, the list had 11 entries on it, and something in his chest told him it wasn't finished growing. A technology newsletter with a modest but sharp readership published a piece 2 weeks later, the kind of headline built to travel, who actually built this platform. The writer had gone through the public commit history, the same records any technical due diligence team checks, and then forgets to mention out loud afterward. Liam's name appeared on nearly 80% of the platform's core infrastructure. Chloe's name appeared on almost none of it, which made sense, because she had never once opened the codebase herself. The reporter reached out to Chloe directly for comment. She answered in 3 sentences that said nothing specific. The platform was built by an incredible early team. She was proud of everyone who contributed, and she looked forward to sharing more about the company's technical journey soon. No names, no correction. No mention that the person responsible for 80% of a code base was sitting 11 feet from her desk most days, still fixing things nobody else understood how to fix, let alone rebuild. She never told Liam the reporter had reached out at all. He found out because a mutual friend forwarded him the article with a single line attached. "Isn't this you?" He read it twice, then a third time, looking for his own name somewhere inside her quoted response. "The way you check a pocket you already know is empty, just to be certain." That night, he asked her about it directly, in the kitchen, while she was reading something on her phone and only half looking up at him. "Did a reporter contact you about the platform? Which one? You know which one." She set the phone down slowly, deliberately, the way people do when they're buying a few extra seconds to build a sentence. "It was nothing, just some blog trying to stir something up before the round closes. I handled it." "You handled it by not mentioning me." "I handled it by not making it a story, Liam." Victor's very clear that any hint of a co-founder dispute right now tanks the valuation conversation. "It's not personal. It's my name." "It's timing," she said, and went back to her phone, as if the sentence had settled something between them for good. He added a 12th entry to the list that night, and next to it wrote 2 words he'd never once written about her in 4 years, not accidental. Then he closed the laptop and sat there a while, realizing it was the first time he'd used a word that harsh about her, even just to himself, even on a page nobody else would ever read. The Series B announcement was scheduled for a Thursday evening, in a rented hall with good lighting and mediocre acoustics, the kind of room companies used when they wanted the trade press to remember the night favorably for years afterward. 300 people were invited. Investors, reporters, early employees, a scattering of people from Chloe's life who mostly existed to be photographed looking proud beside her. 2 nights before, she found him in the office long after everyone else had left, running a final load test on a payment system he still, technically, held the vendor contract for personally, in his own name, unpaid for the risk. She sat on the edge of his desk, which she never did, and waited until he looked up from the screen. "I know it's been a strange few months," she said. "That's one description. I want to fix it Thursday. When they ask what this company is, I'm going to say your name. I'm going to say it clearly, in front of everyone who's ever needed to hear it." He watched her for a long second before answering. "You don't have to make a speech about it." "I want to. You built this with me, from a spare room with a broken router. I've let people forget that, and I'm not doing it anymore. Not tonight, not ever again. Victor's going to be in the room. Victor doesn't run my mouth." He wanted to believe that sentence more than he'd wanted to believe almost anything in 4 years. He nodded and went back to the load test and told himself that whatever had gone wrong over the last 2 months was about to be corrected in front of the one audience that had ever actually mattered. He didn't sleep well those 2 nights, not from doubt exactly, something closer to anticipation, the specific unease of waiting for a door to open that had been shut a long time. He rehearsed nothing himself. There was nothing to rehearse. All he had to do was stand in a room and hear 4 years turn into 2 words. Said once, said honestly, in front of people who would remember it long after the applause ended. On Thursday morning, she texted him a single line: "Wear the gray jacket. Tonight matters." He read it 3 times before he understood it wasn't about the jacket at all. It was the closest she had ever come to saying thank you for something she hadn't done yet, and for a few hours, standing in front of the mirror buttoning that jacket, he let himself believe it was enough. The hall filled up fast, 300 chairs and standing room besides, string lights strung overhead, the way event planners rig a room when they want a stage to feel less like a boardroom and more like an occasion. Chloe stood under it in the cream blazer she saved for nights like this, running through her opening line under her breath while a technician clipped a microphone to her collar. Liam stood near the back, 11 feet from the edge of the stage, close enough to see that her hands were steady. She was good. She always had been. She talked about the early days, the spare room, the 2 years of near misses before the platform found its footing, and the room leaned in the way rooms do when a story is told well by someone who's told it before. She never once, in the first 18 minutes, said his name. He told himself she was saving it. He told himself that was the natural shape of a speech like this. Save the important thing for the end. Build to it. Then came questions. A reporter near the front, notebook already open, asked it in 6 words. Who actually built this platform? The room went still in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone senses the real interview just started. Chloe's eyes moved, just for a second, toward the second row, toward Victor, who didn't move at all. It was the length of a breath. It was long enough. "I built it," she said. I had an incredible early team. Liam was an early contractor who helped out a lot in those first years. Technically brilliant, honestly. But this company, the vision, the execution, that's been me from day one. The applause started before she'd even finished the sentence. The reflexive kind that fills a room whenever a founder says something that sounds like humility and confidence at the same time. Liam clapped too. He didn't know why, except that not clapping would have made him the story, and he had spent 4 years making sure he was never the story. He left before the reception started, walked 11 blocks in the jacket she'd asked him to wear, and didn't call her that night. She found him the next evening, on the balcony of the apartment they shared, and asked what was wrong in a voice that suggested she already suspected the answer and was hoping, quietly, to be told otherwise. "I told you I never wanted the title," he said. "I never wanted my name on a mug or a magazine cover. I wanted exactly one thing, not to be erased." "I didn't erase you. I said contractor. That's not the same as. Contractor is erasure with better manners." She had no answer for that. He watched her search for one anyway, watched the search fail in real time, and understood, standing there in the last of the evening light, that the silence stretching between them was about to become the last honest thing that passed between them for a long while. He didn't decide to leave that night. He decided the next morning, over coffee made in the same machine as always, in an apartment that still smelled faintly of her shampoo. The decision didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as clarity, the specific kind that shows up once a question has finally been answered, even when the answer is the wrong one, even when you'd spent 4 years hoping it would be something else. Day 1, he called his brother. Declan picked up on the second ring, the way lawyers do when they've learned that early calls are usually the important ones. "I need to transfer my equity," Liam said. "All of it, through your office, not the company's counsel." "To who?" "A trust. My name off the cap table by the end of the week." Declan didn't ask why. He asked 3 procedural questions about vesting schedules and buyback clauses, wrote down the answers in a tone that gave nothing away, and told him the paperwork would be ready in 2 days. That was the whole conversation. Neither of them said her name once, and Liam was grateful for that more than he expected to be. Day 2, he went through the systems only he understood, the parts of the company that had never officially belonged to any department because he built them alone, at night, without asking anyone's permission first. A monitoring service that caught outages before customers ever noticed them. A backup pipeline he'd rebuilt 3 separate times because the original vendor kept failing audits. He documented all of it in a single folder, wrote clean instructions for whoever came next, and quietly resigned his personal access from each one, system by system, the way you'd turn off lights in a house you weren't planning to live in anymore. Day 3, he called the landlord and gave notice on the lease, the one that had always been in his name because his credit history had been cleaner than hers when they'd signed it 3 years earlier. He didn't tell her. He told himself, factually, that he was simply doing what needed doing, and that telling her would only turn a decision into a negotiation, and he was finished negotiating for a name that had already been given away in front of 300 people who'd applauded before the sentence even finished. Day 4. The equity paperwork came back from Declan's office, signed and notarized and done. Liam read it twice at the kitchen table, alone, in an apartment where half the furniture already carried sticky notes with prices written in his own handwriting. He didn't feel triumphant reading it. He felt like a man closing a door quietly enough that it wouldn't wake anyone up in the next room, which was, in a way, exactly what he was doing. Day 5. Strangers came through the apartment to buy furniture off a listing he'd posted with careful, honest descriptions. Nothing dramatic, just dimensions and condition, and a fair price. A bookshelf, a reading chair he bought with his first real paycheck, years before any of this had started. A desk that had once been 2 sawhorses and a door, upgraded eventually, but still, in some real sense, the same desk where the whole company had begun on a night neither of them had thought worth remembering at the time. He watched a stranger carry it down 3 flights of stairs and told himself it was just furniture, and mostly, almost, believed it. Day 6. He deleted the accounts that tied his name to her company, the admin logins, the deployment keys, the 2-factor devices registered to a phone number nobody else on the board even knew existed. Each deletion sent an automatic notification somewhere, a small procedural email that would sit unread in an inbox until it eventually mattered to someone. He didn't check whether anyone had opened them yet. He wasn't doing this to be noticed. He was doing it because the version of himself that worked 18-hour days for a company that called him a contractor no longer made sense to keep alive. Day 7. An email arrived that he'd been ignoring for over a year. A lead engineering role overseas, at a firm that had asked him twice before and been turned down twice, both times because leaving would have meant leaving her. He read the offer letter slowly this time, all the way through, and answered before he could talk himself out of it. Yes. Available in 2 weeks. He didn't mention severance, didn't negotiate the number, didn't ask for time to think it over, because the deciding part had already happened somewhere further back than day 7, maybe further back than the stage itself. Day 8. He sat in the empty apartment with a single chair and a mattress on the floor, the last things left, and let his phone ring twice without answering. Her name on the screen, then nothing. He wasn't avoiding the conversation out of anger. He'd simply run out of things he needed her to say, and suspected she had nothing new to offer besides the same 3 sentences from the balcony, rearranged into a slightly different order. Day 9, he woke before sunrise, packed the 2 bags he'd already packed once and unpacked twice to check, and stood in the doorway of an apartment that no longer held a single object he could call his. He set the keys on the counter, the only surface bare enough to hold them. Then he took out his phone, disconnected the number she'd called 11 times over 9 days, and dropped the old card into a trash can outside the building before catching a car to the airport. He didn't tell his parents which flight. He didn't tell Declan either, beyond one line, "I'll call when I land." He boarded the plane without looking back at a city that, for 4 years, he had helped build into something worth erasing him from. Chloe told herself it was a bad week. Men needed space sometimes, especially after a public disagreement, and Liam had never been the type to make a scene, which meant, she reasoned, that whatever was happening inside him would resolve itself the way it always had, quietly, on his own schedule, without her having to push. She called twice on day 9 and left a voicemail she deleted before finishing it, unsure what tone to strike between apology and reassurance. By day 12, the call started going straight to a recording that said the number was no longer in service. She stood in the kitchen holding her phone, replaying the message twice, checking she'd dialed correctly, checking a second time out of a stubbornness that had nothing to do with phone numbers and everything to do with not wanting to be the kind of person a man simply vanishes from without a word first. She went to the apartment on day 14 with her own key, the one she'd never given back after they'd technically stopped living together in name only, and let herself in expecting to find him mid-sulk, maybe packing slowly, maybe already halfway to forgiving her the way he always eventually did before. What she found instead was bare walls, faint, pale rectangles on the paint where furniture used to sit, and a set of keys resting on an otherwise empty counter, catching the late afternoon light like they'd been placed there deliberately, because they had. She stood in the doorway for a long time, phone still in her hand, the screen dark. There was no note, no forwarding address, no explanation taped to a cabinet, nothing that a person leaves behind when they still want to be found eventually, on their own terms. The absence of a note said more than a note ever could have. A note would have meant he still wanted the last word to be his. This meant he'd already said everything he was going to say, on a stage, in front of 300 people who'd started applauding before she'd even finished the sentence that started all of it. She called Declan next, careful and measured, the way you talk to a lawyer even when you're really talking to a brother you barely know. He picked up, listened to her explain that she was worried, that she just wanted to know Liam was safe, that this wasn't about the company at all. "He's safe," Declan said. "That's all I can tell you right now. Can you at least tell him I'm looking for him?" "I think he already assumes that," Declan said, and ended the call before she could ask him anything else, leaving her standing in an apartment that used to be half hers, holding a phone with nothing left to dial. The first sign that something structural had broken came 11 days after the apartment. A vendor invoice bounced, flagged for a payment method that no longer existed, tied to a personal guarantee that nobody on the finance team had ever seen documentation for, because the documentation lived in Liam's name, not the company's, in an inbox that had been deleted along with everything else. It took 2 full days of searching before anyone found the original contract at all, buried in an account nobody remembered even existed. 3 weeks in, a security certificate expired without warning, the kind that renews itself automatically unless the person who originally issued it stops maintaining the account behind it entirely. The platform's checkout flow went dark for 6 hours during a period the company could least afford it. Mid-negotiation with 2 new investors, Victor had lined up to shore up the round after the first 2 backed away. Nobody on the engineering team, which had grown to 11 people under Liam's steady direction, had ever needed to know where that certificate lived, because it had never once failed while he was the one watching it every night. 5 weeks in came the migration, a database restructuring Liam had been running slowly, carefully, over the better part of a year, moving customer records from an aging system to a newer one without ever taking the platform offline to do it. Nobody had documented the full plan because the full plan had only ever existed in his head, updated nightly, adjusted as problems surfaced, never written down because writing it down had never once seemed urgent when the person holding it in his memory showed up every single day without exception. The migration stalled at 60% complete, half the customer data in one format and half in another, and the 2 formats didn't reliably agree with each other about who owed what to whom. Support tickets started arriving faster than the team could read them, let alone answer them. A board member, not Victor, asked out loud in a meeting whether anyone actually understood how the back end worked anymore, and the room went still in a way that answered the question better than any engineer in it wanted to. 2 of the newer engineers quit within the same week, both citing the same reason in their exit interviews without ever comparing notes. Nobody could explain how half the system actually worked, and neither of them had signed up to guess. Their manager forwarded both resignation letters to Chloe with no comment attached, and she read them twice, standing at her desk, before she understood that the letters weren't really about the migration at all. Chloe sat through that meeting without saying much, watching numbers on a slide that had been green for 4 straight years turn a color nobody wanted to name out loud. She thought about a spare room with 2 sawhorses and a door, and a man who had never once, in 4 years, let the company down at 2 in the morning. She hadn't understood, until this exact meeting, how much of it had simply been him, quietly, the whole time, holding it together with his own hands while she stood in front of it and let herself be photographed. She tried Liam's parents next, a phone number she'd had for 3 years and used exactly twice before this call. His mother answered, polite in the specific, careful way that meant she already knew who was calling before Chloe finished saying her own name. "He's fine," his mother said. "He's working. He calls us every Sunday, same time, without fail. Could you just tell him I need to talk to him? Not about the company, about us." There was a pause long enough that Chloe understood, before the answer even came, exactly what shape it would take. "He didn't ask us to hide him from you," his mother said. "He asked us not to make his decisions easier to undo. Those aren't the same thing, and I think, if you sit with it, you already know that." The call ended kindly, which somehow made it land worse than if it had ended cold. Chloe sat with the phone in her lap for a long time afterward, replaying the sentence about undoing decisions, trying to decide whether it had been a warning or simply the truth, and finding, the longer she sat with it, that it could easily be both at once. She went back to Declan one more time, in person, in an office with his name on the glass door and nothing personal on the walls behind him. She asked him plainly what she had to do to reach his brother. "You don't have to do anything," Declan said. "He'll reach you eventually, or he won't. That's not something I control, and it never was. You're his brother. You could just tell me where he is." "I could," Declan said. "I'm not going to. He asked me for exactly one thing before he left, and it wasn't for me to keep you away from him. It was for me to make sure nobody undid what he did out of guilt before he was ready. Yours or his, either one." She didn't have an answer for that, and he didn't wait around for one. Victor's conversation with Liam happened 3 weeks later, over a video call Liam had agreed to only because Declan's office had legally required it. One final handoff of institutional knowledge before the last severed contract closed for good. Victor opened with reassurance, the way he opened everything, talking about how much the company valued Liam's years of contribution, how these things had a way of working out for everyone involved in the end. Liam let him finish. Then he asked one question, flat and unhurried. The kind of question a person asks when they already know the answer and only want to hear the other person fail to give it. "When you told her a solo founder story raises faster, did you know it also meant a solo founder company falls apart faster once the story turns out to be false?" Victor started to answer, reached for a sentence that could turn the question into an opportunity the way he always did, and found, for the first time on the entire call, that there wasn't one waiting for him. "I didn't think so," Liam said, and ended the call before Victor could find one anyway. 6 months passed, the way collapse usually does, not all at once, but in a long series of smaller failures that eventually added up to something the board could no longer explain away. 2 investors pulled out quietly, citing timing. A third stayed but renegotiated terms that gutted the valuation Victor had once promised would make everything safe for good. The migration finally finished, badly, at a cost that took 8 months of runway with it when it went. Chloe kept the company alive, technically, the way a person keeps something alive by tending to it too late and too rarely and calling the effort care regardless. She went back to Declan's office one more time, in early spring, and this time, she didn't ask where Liam was the moment she sat down across from him. She sat quietly for a while first, hands folded in her lap, the posture of someone who had rehearsed a version of this conversation and abandoned it somewhere on the drive over. "I know you're not going to just give me an address," she said. "No. So tell me what you want me to say, because I think you're waiting for something specific from me, and I'd rather know what it is than keep guessing forever." Declan studied her for a moment. The first time in 6 months, he'd looked at her like a person instead of a problem to be managed carefully. "I don't want you to say you hid him. Everyone already knows that part of it." "Then what?" "Say what you actually did. Not the version where you protected the company, or managed Victor, or handled the timing carefully. Say the real one, out loud, in this room." She was quiet long enough that he almost thought she wasn't going to answer at all. When she finally did, her voice had none of the polish it carried on stage. "I chose to be believed over being honest," she said. "I had a room full of people ready to believe whatever I told them, and it was easier to let them believe I did it alone than to explain why I hadn't said his name yet. And once I'd said it the easy way in front of enough people, I didn't know how to go back and say it the true way without it costing me something I wasn't ready to lose." Declan let the sentence sit in the room for a moment before he answered her. "That's the first honest thing I've heard you say about any of this." He slid a folded piece of paper across the desk. On it was a city and nothing else written beside it. The city was smaller than the one they'd built the company in, quieter, with a coastline instead of a skyline. She found the address Declan had given her attached to an engineering firm 2 blocks from the water, and she waited outside for 40 minutes before she saw him leave through the front doors, laughing at something a colleague had said, a woman with a low fade and an easy posture Chloe didn't recognize. He saw her before she said anything. He didn't look surprised, which surprised her more than anger would have. "You found it," he said. "Declan gave me a city. I found the rest. Took you long enough. I had a company falling apart around me. It was a busy 6 months. I heard, you heard, or you watched." "Both," he said. "I still get the vendor alerts. Nobody ever removed my email from the escalation list. I read every one of them and didn't fix a single thing." She didn't have anything to say to that, not right away. He didn't invite her inside, but he didn't walk away either. They ended up on a bench near the water, far enough from the office that his colleague had already disappeared around a corner without looking back. "I'm not here to ask you to come back," Chloe said. "I don't even know if that's what I want anymore. I just needed you to hear the thing I never said out loud to anyone." He waited. "My mother had a business partner once," she said. "Small company. The two of them built it from nothing over 6 years. He handled the money and the paperwork. She handled everything customers ever saw. When it finally succeeded, he told investors it was his idea from the start. She had emails proving otherwise and never once used them, because by then he'd already convinced the whole industry it was his company. She spent the rest of her life being introduced as someone who'd helped out early on. I watched that erase her a little more every year. I told myself I'd never let another name sit next to mine on paper, ever, because I never wanted to be the one erased." "You weren't the one erased," he said. "I was. I know that now. I think some part of me always knew it and just didn't let myself look at it directly, because looking at it meant admitting I'd become the version of him I hated most." He didn't say anything for a while. The water moved the way water does, indifferent to either of them. "I didn't come back for an apology," he finally said. "I came back for one question, and I want an honest answer, not the version that sounds good." Gasket. "Was any of it ever going to be enough? If I'd stayed, if I'd never left, was there a version of this where you said my name in that room, on your own, without a reporter forcing the question?" She opened her mouth to answer quickly, the way she always had, and then stopped herself and took the time the question actually deserved. "I don't know," she said, "and I think that's worse than if I told you no." He didn't answer her that night, not because he didn't have an answer, but because some questions are better left to sit exactly where they land. They talked a while longer on the bench, about nothing that mattered as much as what had already been said, and then she went back to her hotel, and he went back to an apartment with his name on the lease and nobody else's. He didn't go back to the company. There was no press release, no public correction, no stage moment where the record got set straight in front of an audience that had already moved on to the next founder's story. Some erasures don't get undone with an announcement, they just stop growing. And the person who was erased builds something new somewhere else, where nobody has to be reminded that his name belongs there, because it simply always did, on the org chart, on the lease, on the door. Maya, his team lead at the new firm, had introduced him on his first week the way she introduced everyone, by what he'd built rather than by what he'd survived. "This is Liam," she'd said, in front of the whole team, without hesitation. "He's leading the payments migration. Ask him anything, he actually answers." Nobody there needed a story about a stage or a spare room. They just needed to know he could hold a system together, and he could, and that was the whole conversation. It wasn't a rescue, and it wasn't a romance. Maya never asked why he'd left his last company, and he never offered the story, and somehow that made the office easier to walk into every morning than any room he'd stood in over the previous 4 years. It was simply a room that let his name sit on the wall without anyone deciding whether he'd earned it first. The first time she put his name on a slide for a company-wide update, she didn't check with him beforehand, didn't ask if he minded, didn't treat it as a favor. She just typed it, the way you'd type anyone's name who'd done the work, and moved on to the next slide. Chloe called twice more over the following weeks. He let both go to voicemail, listened to neither immediately, and eventually didn't unblock the number at all. It wasn't cruelty. He'd simply run out of reasons to keep a door open that had already told him everything it was going to say. Some mornings, out of habit more than longing, he'd order 2 coffees before catching himself and canceling the second one at the counter. It happened less with each month that passed, until eventually it didn't happen at all, and that small, unremarkable morning where he only ordered 1 coffee without thinking about it twice felt like the quietest kind of ending there is. If you've ever built something for someone and waited for them to say your name in a room that mattered, you already understand the difference between leaving in anger and leaving for good. Anger wants to be heard. It slams doors, it sends the text, it waits by the phone for the apology that proves the hurt was real. Leaving for good doesn't need any of that. It just stops needing an audience at all. The loudest thing you can ever say to someone isn't a confrontation, and it isn't a confession either. It's the silence that comes after you've said everything you needed to say, once, clearly, and then simply stopped waiting for them to say it back. Liam didn't destroy the company that erased him. He just stopped being the reason it worked, and let the silence that followed answer the question he'd spent 4 years too afraid to ask out loud.